Well, I want to welcome you to our program today. We have a very special guest. Her name is Sister Joy Peterson, and so thank you so much, Sister Joy, for being a guest on the program today. And the subject that we're going to be talking about today is human trafficking. You know, it seems like more and more we've been hearing about human trafficking. I know for me, it seems like over the past, 5 years ago, I think is when I really started hearing about this word trafficking. And there were people who were really activists in this, and I just had never heard of it, and I thought, well, what are they really talking about here? But then, you know, more and more I've been hearing Christians talking about this. I've been hearing about it in the news, and so, Sister Joy, when we hear this word, human trafficking, what exactly are we talking about here?
Oh, that's a very good place to begin. I think we could say that human trafficking involves someone who's been forced or coerced or by means of fraud into a behavior. They may have been literally trafficked, transported from one place to another, and they are sometimes sold for labor or sometimes for sexual purposes, sometimes for their body parts, for organs that might be transported. So while this was initially something that I think most of us thought happened in faraway lands, we've come to realize that there's more than we would like to recognize happening right here in our own backyards.
Yeah, and so when we think about our human nature and we think about, oppression, and, I mean, we'd almost like to think that goes all back to the barbaric days, right? But, we still are dealing with some very awful issues in today's society. And I'm just so very thankful for people like yourself who are activists. We think about being Christian, we want to praise the Lord, and that's all very important. And we want to be Christians in our lives and in our actions. But it's also very important to be striving for peace and justice in the world, and to be not turning our heads toward things that, such as human trafficking, but to say that these are real issues and we need to get involved. But I think a lot of that involvement, first of all, just begins because we can feel powerless, and a lot of it has to do with maybe being naive. I think we start by just learning about, just what is this, and I think that's kind of what you have shared now, is to say that it's people who are being forced to go against their will into, a very unhealthy lifestyle that, is very troublesome.
That's right. Well, I think most of us want to believe in the goodness of human nature and in the scriptural call to take care of the least of our brothers and sisters. And that's really at the root of, I think, what being an advocate in drawing people to awareness about human trafficking falls back to. On the other side, I think the greed that happens in some persons is what often drives the human trafficking. Currently, the estimation is that about $39 billion a year are made by people who traffic other persons. So that's just astounding to consider. It's perhaps almost as big as drug trafficking in its purpose and origins.
So it's really, kind of driven, it's a money-driven thing, greed-driven, then that you're taking advantage of another person for your own financial gain, so to speak.
That's right, that's right. So it could be someone who is being forced into a labor situation where they're kept as a housekeeper, and the family that brings that person legally into this country then keeps that person isolated and unable to seek any kind of outside connections that might give them a sense of a voice for themselves. So they get their housework done by someone, or it could be involved in some kind of a sexual encounter where someone else is profiting on behalf of that person's mistreatment.
Yeah, so it's not just something that's going on in another country, but it's happening here in the United States. this very thing. And so it generally has to do with labor. And that's the thing that I've been hearing so much, and it just seems like it's just such an injustice thing where we're always, people are, where do we find the cheap labor today?
That's right.
Where in this world do we find cheap labor, whether it's to move a factory to another country, but then now in this case trying to get workers from somewhere else to come in and to have that cheap labor.
That's right. That's right. Sometimes, a few years ago in Fargo, North Dakota, for example, a group of men were legally brought into the country to work. Men from India were brought to Fargo, which always makes me think, what an adjustment that must have been.
Yeah.
So when they were brought here, all of their papers were taken away from them, and then they were forced by this company to work, to labor on their behalf. And eventually, through some people who saw and wondered what was really happening here, that was reported to the police, and those laborers were freed from that slavery that they were being held in.
Yeah, and so as we look at this, who are the most vulnerable?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it depends. We could maybe say it's someone who's in need. And that need might mean that they need attention, they need some financial support, they need to feel loved. So in Iowa, for instance, we have a relatively high incidence of runaway youth, and runaway youth are often considered vulnerable for being taken in by a trafficker. They are, maybe something in their home wasn't so helpful to them. Maybe they were just not satisfied with things in their lives, and so they run away. And oftentimes what will happen is someone who's going to traffic them kind of primes them in a sense. They may notice them in a mall and befriend them in some way, just begin by smiling at them, saying, hello, how are you? And bit by bit enticing them into an unhealthy situation that eventually might literally mean being transported away from where they are.
Yeah, so when you think about like somebody like that who maybe doesn't feel accepted, lonely, and then that need of acceptance and a sense of togetherness or fellowship, but then there's probably other things, needs that are being met at that time. I mean, if somebody's hungry or out in the
Right.
cold, that I can just see where, they would be very vulnerable and would be prime suspects or targets in order to
Yes.
get them lured in.
Yes. And the Polaris Project, which is a national project that not just provides some linkages for people who want to know more about human trafficking, but also keeps statistics. Currently, the Polaris Project says that the most vulnerable young people are between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. So these almost what we would say pre-adolescents who are vulnerable emotionally in so many ways are likely to be targeted by many of the traffickers that are about in these days. And so there are lots of little ways to kind of help, perhaps we might say, bolster the self-confidence of young people to resist those kinds of lures.
Yeah, so now you're part of a coalition then.
Right.
And so why don't you explain a little bit about this coalition?
Sure. I'm part of what we call ourselves the Tri-State Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And this group was initially formed by Catholic sisters from the Dubuque area. I actually work for the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters, and we traverse back and forth across the river a lot with our causes and collaborating on things. So that coalition has also now begun to expand and to invite a number of other people to come and be part of that. There's another group in Dubuque that's also working against human trafficking, and we've done some collaborative efforts with that group, and our coalition against human trafficking has really decided that we have, most of us are former educators, so we have some gifts to educate, to draw awareness to the issues to people. The other wonderful coalition is made up of younger women who bring some skills that and some presence to a younger community. So we kind of see that we have some collaborative gifts there that cover many bases in the area. So both of our groups have done presentations to a variety of the different churches in the city, and we're always looking for other occasions to do some educational opportunities.
I would think that'd be very helpful, because this has got to be a concern, amongst parents and also society, learning more about this and what are things that we can do to prevent this. And so as we think about, a person like yourself, Sister Joy, and the others who are part of your coalition here, that I think it would be very helpful if your church or other organizations would invite her to come and to be able to become more aware of just what is going on. And here again, I think sometimes the reason why we have so many problems in our society today is that people just sit back. They don't want to get involved. But I think that when people get engaged, and what a purposeful thing to be doing is to try to be doing what we can to prevent these very things from happening, because it seems like it's not just an individual concern, it's not just an individual problem,
right,
or even just a specific family problem here and there. It seems like this is really a societal problem where we've got to be working on a lot of different things. What makes, like you say, a young girl or boy vulnerable to be trafficked. And so that's, something that society has to continue to address. I don't know, if there's, 5 things that to say, well, this is what makes somebody vulnerable, if there is such a thing. I imagine that probably maybe for everyone it's a whole different story, and what has brought a person to this point of, like you say, leaving their home or going someplace. It might be very different from person to person. I don't know what, as far as that vulnerability, is there like breakdown in the family, or other issues of being bullied at school? I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. Yes, that's right.
I think that there are a lot of issues. There are young people from homes that are very stable and protective of their children. Okay. There are children who are from homes where there might be some other kinds of maybe some addictions among the parents, or some really serious financial struggles, and where there might be some, the parent is so in goodwill, so engaged in trying to provide a livelihood for their family, or that they're not as available to their children as they might be. Or there might be, there's a fair number of children who just have some issues about their own sexuality that they're trying to work out, that have become quite vulnerable to trafficking. So it's I don't think there's exactly what we would say a look for these items, but there are ways that I think we can, for instance, if we see somebody who seems like an adult who doesn't allow the other person to speak at all, or if that person doesn't seem to really know, because often traffickers want to take the person who's being trafficked out of a familiar place into an unfamiliar place, that again makes them more vulnerable. So if the person seems like they don't know what their address is, they avoid eye contact. These are actually some things that the Iowa State Highway Patrol is training some of their patrolmen to be aware of if they stop a car and they're concerned about how one of the people in the car is behaving, that might be a clue to them that they need to ask some more questions. And I think that's more and more our law enforcement people are looking for clues like that that might cover them to intervene in some way.
Okay, so for all of us who may be watching here today, what would be, what would be some things that, like what would be some things that we could do so that we're not just sitting back, being powerless, but that's part of it, is just to say, well, if we just knew what we could do, then we will do it, and we will make a difference and see what we can all do to try to alleviate this problem.
Well, I'd say, first of all, that we want to be as loving to anyone that we meet as we possibly can without fawning over the person. I think we want to have our eyes open to the fact that there are possibilities. There's a recent movie, I think the title was Any Child, was actually featured a young woman from Dubuque who was trafficked when she was 14. She started doing some drugs, and one thing led to another, and she became a partier, so to speak, and eventually somebody took her out of Dubuque to Chicago and began to put her on the street, so to speak. So to believe, first of all, that in our midst that this can happen, I think educating ourselves on the possibilities that are here, even in terms of what might be some labor situations where a person might be forced to, for instance, in some situations I've heard of within a fairly decent radius of Iowa, Wisconsin, where there have been immigrant laborers who, when they've tried to ask for a bigger wage, the farmer or the owner of the property where they're working has said, well, you are here without documentation, I can turn you into the police. So that's a kind of, when we talk about coercion, situations like that. So I would say educate and keep our eyes open, and as the Polaris people say, if you see something, say something. And there is a Polaris hotline number that could be called, 1-888-3737-888. Or if you're concerned, and that's, many people will suggest just putting that number into your phone, or call 911. Call your local police and express your concern.
Yeah, and that's all, I can just see where that's all a lot of, just as I've been with people. One of the things is that I hear people justify, trafficking, saying, well, yeah, we got this illegal immigrants who are working here, but they're making more money than what they would in the country that they come from, and then eventually they're sending the money back, and so they're all happy, and so somehow we're all justified in doing this. I mean, I hear this an awful lot. Well, they're better off, being trafficked and getting paid this sub wage, comparatively speaking. And so I guess that's part of it too, is that we just rationalize to where we, think that somehow we're justified in doing this.
Yes. I think a really good example that even relates to something foreign about that is that in the last couple of years, a lot of information has come to light about people who are mostly fishermen in the Pacific who really fish for what we might say the Thai fishing industry. But when we go to the grocery store and we buy cheap fish, it's not unusual to think that maybe that fish was caught by people who are kept enslaved on fishing boats. That in lots of ways there are elements that are purchasing, and not just about the immigrants who might be working in local farms, but on some of the products that we purchase, child labor. Cotton picking in many countries is done by children to this day, and so those children are kept from school, and I personally love the feel of cotton clothing, so I have to ask myself, how much does my buying of a variety of products contribute to other people making my life easier and making their lives less satisfying?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a lot of what we like, is that we go and we can get, a product that we really want, and we're not going to complain if it's cheaper.
Right.
I mean, I think that's, kind of the lie in this whole thing.
Yes.
Is that we can go to this place and we can get our products now a lot cheaper, and so, but do we think as to why they're cheaper? That's, part of an injustice too, to say, well, it's almost like we're getting away with something here. Mm-hmm. But it's really taking advantage of people.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it's just all these, kind of these stigmas that we kind of hide behind, or these fallacies that or these rationales that we use to try to justify all these things. Well, because I've heard that too. Well, by having this, we have cheap food.
Yes.
And it's greed driven.
It is, and it's and at the same time, it's also very challenging. I had the opportunity to go to Guatemala for a few times when some of my presentation sisters were ministering down there, and there are factories there where mostly women are sewing our clothes. And so I come home and I look at a label and a blouse that I might want to buy, and I see that it's made in Guatemala. So one part of me says, well, if I buy this, then it is, at least it's providing them a salary. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if I'm honest about that, then I have to realize that many times those factories have kind of a slave labor condition about them. So then I say to myself, well, then I won't buy any clothes made in Guatemala. But when we look at our clothing, a good deal of it's made by people from other countries. Mm-hmm. So we as a U.S. culture are surrounded by the labor of people from various parts of the world, mm-hmm. and not all of it is slave labor by any means, but we have to be aware that some of it probably is.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you look at the tri-state here, and Dubuque and the surrounding area, which most of our viewers, that's where we would be. We look at this whole subject, and as we look at this area, that as people see something that's suspicious, and here again, a lot of times it's like, well, I don't want to get involved, or, if I get involved, then somehow I'm going to be the one who's going to get hurt in this whole process. But that's where we have to just kind of take a stand and to say, well, for the sake of others, I mean, after all, Jesus sacrificed himself for the sake of all of us. But when we do see something suspicious, it's not like we have to, like we don't go to that person and say, hey, look what you're doing, or to the person who's been trafficked. But that's where you have given us some good advice to say, well, call 911 or call the Polaris hotline number, which we will have up on the screen, as examples of what we can do, so that, because I think sometimes even if we're just not for certain, it's
mm-hmm.
always best
mm-hmm.
to have them check it out, and even if everything is fine, but a lot of times we think, well, I'm sure everything is fine when it's not.
Yes,
mm-hmm.
yes. Well, I think if I could just look at my note here for a moment, the Polaris hotline actually keeps track of states where calls have been made from.
Okay.
And so I think in the last year there were about 120 calls from Iowa reporting potential situations of human trafficking. And that statistic only is, their last date of keeping that record was the end of September. Mm-hmm. So out of that 120 calls, there were 30 probable cases. So I think that, you know, that's about a fourth of the cases that are, and Polaris, if you go to the Polaris Project website, they actually will give you, you can look at the hotline information, and they'll break that down into the fact that in Iowa they thought the bulk of those calls had to do with sex trafficking. There was a certain percentage was labor trafficking. Sometimes it's both labor and sex trafficking that's being recorded. But as you say, making connection with something like that calls us out of our comfort zone, and that's part of our call as Christians, isn't it? To keep stepping out of the safe and comfortable.
We like the safe and comfortable, don't we? But like you say, Jesus is calling us to, I think of Peter, get out of the boat and
That's
start
right.
walking on the water, as frightening as it may be. This is a case where it's not so much, it's not about me, but it's about Jesus, and it's about those who are being taken advantage of and those who are being hurt. And so that's where, you know, as Christian people, you know, we're called to carry the cross, and that's part of carrying the cross, isn't
right.
it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I really am very thankful for the work that you are doing in this area. And here again, I encourage you to, you know, to call the number as far as getting Sister Joy to come to your church or your organization to talk more about this. It's something that we just can't remain silent about and just turn our head to, but we have to continue to do what we can in order to alleviate what has become a very societal problem.
Yes.
And you know, here again, it's always something where I'd like to just say, well, it happens somewhere else,
Right.
but it's now happening right within our own communities and so forth. And we do love our neighbors, and we love our, you know, our children, and so here again, we all do need to be very concerned.
Yes. Well, thank you. And I think it's an honor to be able to share this story with you and to bring our neighbors into more awareness of this great struggle.
Public awareness is so very important. Yes. And so here again, the love that the Father has for us, that we are all free in Jesus. He has freed all of us, and we're all equal, and so we have to just kind of see humanity, you know, not from a trafficking standpoint, but from a human dignity standpoint, that these are children of God, for whom God cares about and for whom we also are called to love and to serve.